Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's a joy to be at the film festival and doing this. And thank you to Shatterglass for hosting. As he mentioned, I'm a former associate professor at Benedictine University. I got to put my teaching voice back on. It's a little rusty, so I'll get at it. And I want to focus on Lindsay, but what I want to do is I want to give just a brief summary of some of what he had talked about. That's difficult because Lindsay did so many things, but then I want to move on and give a summary of his film theory and film criticism. And really, as I'm talking, think about how some of this applies today. This was 1915, so we're talking about 102 years ago, but some of what he's talking about, some of it foolish, some of it prophetic. So that's where the conversation I would enjoy us to have afterward here, Radio Maria or wherever. So as I said, The Art of the Moving Picture, 1915 book. Above all, Lindsay felt he was a pen and ink artist. That's what he wanted to be. He would doodle on everything and anything. Here we have an image of the wedding of the rose and the lotus, and this was he would do a pen and ink art, and then he would write a poem within it. But it was his poetry that eventually eclipsed his pen and ink art. For example, here, The Wedding of the Rose and the Lotus, probably one of his most famous. This is about the marriage of the seas at the opening of the Panama Canal. This was read to Congress. This was presented to every congressman. This was presented as handouts at the Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco. So this was really his kind of a big deal for him, but it was the poem that got all the attention, not the art. And at this time, Midwest poetry was getting really a lot of attention. So as Edgar Lee Masters, Carl Sandburg. This is one of our editions of Quiddity, the international literary journal that we founded and edit, and this was one that featured several works of art by Lindsay. The performance poet, that was one of the things that he was also known for. Unfortunately, he died before any recordings were made of his voice. We have those of Carl Sandburg, we have those of some of the era, but we don't have any of his voice. One of the things about this performance poetry is, again, he's groundbreaking unintentionally at times. He kind of stumbles into this. He was invited to Baylor University in Waco, Texas to do a performance, and he couldn't afford it. So he told A.J. Armstrong, the professor there, that if you'll book me some gigs along the way, I can pay for my trip and come back. So he was actually the first poet, performance artist to use a booking agent. Again, unintentionally. One of the things he's also recognized for is the break that he gave to Langston Hughes. And this is one thing that often goes unnoticed. This is actually Langston Hughes as a busboy. Lindsay was in D.C. to give one of his performance poems. This was at the height of his performance poetry career. Hughes was a busboy at the same hotel, and he had slipped some poems on the table where Lindsay was reserved to eat lunch. He found the poems, asked to speak to the young man who had left them behind, and then that night, instead of reading his own poetry, he performed Langston Hughes' poems. And he said, this is a young man who has more talent than I. And after that, the next morning, reporters were all over the hotel. Langston Hughes' life completely changed. And he kind of became a part of the family, the Springfield, Illinois family where Lindsay is from, and would visit often. Another thing he would do is he mentioned the hobo and the tramping. This was to spread what Lindsay called his gospel of beauty. Everything falls under his gospel of beauty. He strives for nothing less than to save the soul of America in everything he does. I always like to say he does simple things, but he never does things simply. So he had these pamphlets, Rhymes to be Traded for Bread, and you can see what the rules are. The rule number 1, keep away from cities. 2, keep away from railroads. 3, have nothing to do with money, carry no baggage. Times to ask for dinner, times to ask for lunch. And he would basically trade performance for meals and room and board. By firesides, entertain children on farms or whatever, and they would put him up for the night. So he did this. He walked from 1906 Florida to Kentucky. 1908, New York to Ohio, and then in 1912 from Illinois to New Mexico. Actually trying to make it to LA, but he only got as far as New Mexico. And this presages the hobo era of the 20s and 30s. So again, innovative, unintentionally, but he said he was willing to die for his art, and he felt like sometimes he might do that along the roadside. And then the last thing I just want to talk about, and this is sort of his magnum opus, the Golden Book of Springfield. And there's a reason why I mention this now. He envisioned a reinvention of America with Springfield, Illinois, not far from here, as its golden city on a hill at the center. Obviously didn't come true, and this really harmed his creativity, it harmed his reputation, and it harmed him spiritually, because he invested everything he had into his art. His art was his life, and the two were inseparable. But the reason I mention this is it was supposed to be fulfilled by November of 2018. According to Lindsay. So next November, keep your eye on Springfield. See if it suddenly becomes a golden city on the hill. It might. It was a disappointment to him. But again, when I discovered Lindsay, I grew up near Springfield, but I really discovered his film theory first. You get outside of the area, everyone knows about his film theory. You get close to Springfield, most people know just about his poems, his drawings. So it's an interesting kind of donut where we're sitting, kind of in the donut hole. But his film theory is as much social theory as it is film theory. And this includes the aesthetics of what he calls the photoplay. And again, nothing short of the salvation of America. He sees in this new art a high art and an accessible art. As with his Gospel of Beauty, he is in everything he does, either prophetically or foolishly. And in fact, Stanley Kaufman, who wrote the introduction to the 1970 version, he calls Lindsay a fool. He describes the book as a foolishness on a scale and out of a fire that triumphs over common sense. I love that description. And to me, I say, well, we need more fools then, because that's incredible. George William Eggers, who was the director of the Art Museum in Denver, said that to Lindsay, art is reality. There is no separation of the two. So like I said, to him there was a new renaissance in this new art, and life and art are inseparable. The word he applies to great cinema throughout the book is transfiguration. And that is to, not just for actors, but for everything, not just to embody something, but to truly, actually become it. And that's how he approached everything he did. He became it. He didn't just, he walked those roads. He reinvented America in the Golden Book. He was all in all the time. When you do that, you're bound to run into some frustration and some disappointments along the way, and I think he eventually does. But this is definitely a very crusading book, and he sees this motion picture as high art, not just mere entertainment, but really life-altering. He does get it very, very wrong in some places, but as we talk, I want to get to where he gets it extremely right, more so than he could possibly have imagined. Some of the recognition for the book, again, considered the first major book on film criticism. Francis Hackett reviewed it in 1915 in the New Republic, and I quote, he said, "It's really bold and brilliant theory. It takes first place as an interpretation of the greatest popular aesthetic phenomenon in the world. He has initiated photoplay criticism. That is a big thing to have done, and he has done it." He was encouraged to begin his own film studio because he had such a grasp on film aesthetics. The 1915 edition was used as a textbook at Columbia School of Journalism in their photoplay writing class, likely one of the first classes of its kind. So he may have initiated the first textbook for film writing. He was invited several times to speak there. Many universities would bring him in to talk to their film classes, photoplay classes. He was invited to be the photoplay critic at the New Republic for writing the book. D.W. Griffith had invited him to be his guest at the premiere of Intolerance because of everything that he did with it. And then suddenly the work just kind of disappeared. The book was gone, fell out of favor for some reason. And probably, I'll talk about how some people describe it. But then there was a new version came out in 1970. And with this is the version that I have, came an introduction by Stanley Kaufman. He calls the book dated and cranky. He calls it hyperbolic and self-appointedly supreme. Lofty. Yet he sees it as the work most worthy of Lindsay's legacy, of his survival, because he does so much with it. And then, of course, in 2000, the Modern Library came out with a new edition, and Martin Scorsese, he had put together a quartet of film books and had written the introduction to it. So that's a little bit about the recognition he got for it at the time and beyond. One of the things he does in this book is he writes a lot of it in second person. So really the book is a set of instructions. It's a set of instructions for readers and audiences, as well as producers, directors. And so to the readers, throughout the book, he assumes that you're reading the book around 8 o'clock in the evening, because then what he wants you to do is read a chapter, get up, walk around the corner to the theater, go downtown, watch a film, pick any film, and apply what you've read. And I'll get to more about how he considers we should do that. But so really it's kind of an instruction manual in that way, that the book is to be not just consumed but applied. Same as a film. Film is not just for entertainment. It's to be consumed and applied and to enrich. Then for the producers and directors and actors, Lindsay says he really praises D.W. Griffith. In fact, he refers to the two parts of his book as an open letter to D.W. Griffith. And he sees him as the king figure, because at the time he was doing such incredible and great things. He compares him to Christopher Marlowe, to Lord Byron. He's as close to the Michelangelo of film as you can get to him, though he's not there yet. He's still looking. But he's encouraging us to go back and watch old films, short films. He's saying that short films are best, and if you watch some of these old silent pictures, they're pretty epic. They're pretty long. But he, being a Springfield native, he holds Abraham Lincoln up on a pedestal as well. And so he said, look to the Gettysburg Address as a great example of brevity, of great art, great poetry, in something just 273 words. Simple and brief. I was going to include one of my favorite photos of Lincoln is at Gettysburg, and you can see him in the crowd, but he's really blurry. And that's because the photographer thought he was going to talk for like an hour, and so he was going to take his picture delivering the Gettysburg Address, and by the time he got the camera all set up, Lincoln was sitting down already. So he only got him like this. It's one of my favorite pictures of Lincoln. But the man who spoke before Lincoln talked for 2 hours, and nobody can remember his name. So there's eloquence and there's beauty in brevity, and that's what Lindsay is trying to get at. But one of the things he's already starting to see is commercialization in film. That's why he's saying go back to older films. Study some of the older ones. So one of the things that Lindsay does in this book is he separates films into 3 types and associates each one with a more traditional art form so that we can study those art forms. He's trying to get filmmakers to get into museums, to get into places to see what else is happening or has happened and apply those. So we have painting in action, intimacy, and splendor. And with those, we have the art sculpture as action, painting for intimacy, and for splendor, he looks to architecture. And what he's trying to do is break down the fourth wall, like the fourth wall in the theater. He's trying to break down that fourth wall by using these art forms in concert to break down the fourth wall within the person in the audience, the soul. Again, he's striving for that salvation, and so he's trying to get in deep. And so he would rather see talented craftsmen in painting and sculpting and architecture making films than just people from the vaudeville circuit. He doesn't want just mere entertainment. Sculpture, I'll just talk briefly about each one of these just to give you an idea of what he's talking about. Sculpture, as he says, the film should have the majesty but not the stillness of a sculpture. And if you look at a good sculpture, a good painting, your eye should move around it. It should just naturally flow around it in circular motions, always seeing something new. And that's what you get in a good sculpture. And that's what he wants in a good film as well. A film should not be as jolting to our nervous system. He looks to Guatemala by Donatello as a good example of this. In fact, he's telling, these examples are ones he's using very specifically in the book for producers, directors, actors to go and look at. To him, and I quote, he sees more action in this than he does any cowboy hordes I have ever beheld zipping across the screen. This is the model to look to. He also refers to Abraham Lincoln by Borglum as a study of the thinking man. Every actor, he says, should go and study this sculpture. And so he's giving us very specific instructions on how we can make better films. Let's see. So in painting, film being the illusion of motion, and we look at that word photoplay here. Since film is simply a series of photos in motion, what he says is first comes the photograph, and then comes the motion. So what we need to do is focus on the photo, make a good picture, and then give it good motion. Don't just strive for motion. And that's the problem he sees in action films of the era, 1915, that he's seeing. And so to do this, every still should be as wonderful and as great as a painting in a museum. And then that gives it that wonderful motion. And this, he says, even extends to movie posters. A theater has the potential to be an art gallery along the sidewalk. You could take the best stills from the movies and put them out there and really touch somebody with those. But at the time, he says they're picking the worst shots and the worst photos, and they're using those instead. But so he sees every bit of this as a potential to get to enlighten people, to enlighten the general public. So he gives some examples: Whistler's paintings or a Japanese print. This kaleidoscope in arrest. He said, just imagine it with motion. Imagine the shot that comes before and after. These are the shots that he wants to see in films. The works of Rembrandt. When we talk about light and shadow, he loves the fade in and the fade out. He encourages, again, directors and producers to look at these. With the work of Caravaggio, again, when we look at the fading in, the fading out, the gentleness, there's a softness to it. This is what he wants to see, again, in pictures. And then when we talk about architecture, he's trying to counter the idea that architects lacked creativity at the time, but to him, architects had the greatest potential to make films ultra creative, to really bring in the best. And he holds up this film, The Knights of Cabiria, in 1914, for how closely it resembles Rome and Carthage, as an example of how the architecture is not just a backdrop. It's not just there behind the actors to give the actors a place to stand. It comes forward. It becomes a part of it. As he says, structures in films must also be transfigured. They must be considered and designed more than mere stage arrangements. Backgrounds should clamor for utterance through the figures in front of them. The way he says, Athens finds her soul in Athena. Athena is a part of the architecture of Athens. And they are inseparable, yet stand together and apart at once. And so we think about works created for a space. When you think about an art gallery, you think about a space created for art. And what he's talking about here is art created for a space. And so he looks at some of the examples. And anyone ever been to Boston to the Isabella Gardner Museum? She was a wonderful woman who, she would host these lavish parties, and John Singer Sargent and Whistler and Henry James and all these wonderful artists and philosophers used to just hang out there. And they would come in and they would see a space like this hallway right here, one of my favorite John Singer Sargent paintings. He saw this long corridor and he said, I see a painting for that, and he made it. And this thing is huge, by the way. It's huge. So it's a different concept, and that's what he's saying film should do as well. It should incorporate the architecture and the art should work together, not one before the other. And so he also holds up the Boston Public Library. These are some more John Singer Sargent paintings that he talks about, but the wall painting should be, and I'll quote, an organic part of the surface on which it appears. It is in the same lines as the building and adapted to the colors and forms of the structure for which it is a part. So this is Sargent's Holy Grail series. His Prophets, which Lindsay describes as pillar-like. And here we see some other works that, again, the building came first, and then the art was made for the space. One of the others, and I'll just briefly pass through this one, is Winged Victory, which was sculpted and made with light and shadow in mind. And I'll make sure I get the artist's name right here. Tintoretto, he would create a smaller version, put it inside a box, and then cut an aperture where he could light a candle, and he could study how the light would hit it from different angles. And so this was designed for this particular space in mind, because you can see how the light moves across it throughout a day, ever changing. And again, these are examples that Lindsay holds up as how you build an art form with architecture in mind. The background and the art in front of it are coexistent. One of the things that Lindsay really strives for here is a democratization of ideas, of inspiration, of beauty. And so this new art, he sees in it an ancient tradition being reborn, hieroglyphs. To him, it's picture writing. It's the narrative form in visuals. And he describes even, he read the Book of the Dead, and he said it's the best movie I've ever seen because of the tremendous visuals in it and the tremendous narrative. So he returns to Egypt as a standard here for film. In fact, he even invented his own hieroglyphs, American hieroglyphic system, trying to get us to abandon word thinking and really move us as an entire country into picture thinking. And so you can see how cinema moved him, how he saw this and he thought, this is incredible. This is what an opportunity. The poor and the lower classes, they come out to films in great numbers. And when we talk about Walt Whitman, who wrote about democracy, and that's fantastic, but not enough of the democracy is reading Whitman's poems. But everybody goes to movies, and that's what Lindsay saw. You don't have to know how to read to go to it. You don't have to have a lot of money. If you live in a farm community, you don't have a museum, but you do have a movie theater. So you can have paintings, sculptures come to you if producers and directors would just really tie those high arts in with this. So the people's message will reach the people at last, and that was his ultimate goal here. D.W. Griffith. I'm gonna breeze past him just for the sake of time, but Lindsay praises him, but I mean, who else but Griffith? I mean, he makes fantastic films, and he has this great big asterisk next to his name. I mean, that inescapable and horrible asterisk with Birth of a Nation. You cannot escape it, despite the great films that he has managed to make. And that was one of the things that Lindsay, in his praise of him, he does villainize him for Birth of a Nation because, and there is what he calls the crowd splendor film. when a director can make a film with a large mass of people and really make it flow and look wonderful. And he said nobody can do that like Griffith. But what he did with Birth of a Nation, he says, is he turned the crowd into a mob. And he took Reverend Dixon's terrible play, The Klansman, turned it into this horrible film, and then he goes on to talk about his other films, and again the accomplishments that he made. But Lindsay, as much as he praises Griffith, he still holds him to account for that. Some of his favorite actors. Thought we'd mention some of the examples that he holds up and why. Lillian Gish, he loves her. He says that she is the best in intimate films, which are films most associated with paintings, tight interior spaces, closed-in garden scenes. He says are best for her. Like, he really thinks all this through. But the quality of her films, he says, have let her down. Mary Pickford, another that he admires. As he says, her face is as if Botticelli painted her portrait. So I gave you a Botticelli alongside. He loved the magazines, by the way. He loved Hollywood magazines. He would clip pictures out of them. He wants us to do it. He would say, buy the magazines, cut the pictures, and sit and think about them, and try to think about the scene just before, the shot just after. Like, really, really absorb the photos that you get in these great Hollywood magazines. Douglas Fairbanks. To him, The Three Musketeers was the perfect action picture. Perfect. Now, Lindsay wrote a second book in 1922, and I'll briefly mention it later on, but in his second book, he devotes 6 chapters just to Douglas Fairbanks, which is at the time the most focused study, bless you, the most focused study of its kind in film. And so studying Douglas Fairbanks and The Thief of Baghdad. And this is Hollywood was Lindsay's Baghdad. He wanted to be such a part of it. And if in The Thief of Baghdad, he was always kind of an outsider coming from the wilderness. And Lindsay always felt he wanted in, always a little bit outside, never quite breaking in. He used to hang out with Fairbanks at his home and things like that, but he just never made it in. And then Charlie Chaplin, he adored. Chaplin, he says, has a soul. He praises beauty and he denounces commercialization. But what's interesting is he doesn't like any of his films. He just likes Chaplin. To him, Chaplin is, he's the O. Henry. He has an O. Henry double meaning to all of his antics, both tragic and funny at the same time. And I quote, he reminds him of Edgar Allan Poe, if Poe had set out to make people laugh. So it's an interesting characterization. So really what Lindsay is looking for is a prophet wizard, someone to come along, like an Egyptian king, an Egyptian priest, and the theater to him was this cave where you would enter and you'd be washed in light, and you would always leave enlightened. You would always leave touched and moved, and that was his goal. And so, certain images, certain films, again, the soft shadows would draw people in, as he says. The people would come in and then exit the theater softly, I quote, as foam returns to the darkness of the evening sea. So this, again, more than just entertainment. As far as the relationship between scientists and artists, he did not leave this out. And this is one of my favorite pictures of Edison, by the way. The power napper. I imagine a lot of work happened at this moment, during the power nap. I met an author once who said, if you really want to be a writer, what you need to do is find someone who understands that laying on the couch doing this is work. Because sometimes that's where you do your best work. So I love Edison for this. To him, he calls Edison the new Gutenberg. He has produced the new printing press. And as he says, the state that realizes this may lead the soul of America day after tomorrow. He gives all honor to Edison, admires him for what he did. However, it's only in the hands of artists where the science becomes something that moves us. And that's where he says the scientists really should serve the artists. Because he gave us this kinetoscope, wonderful invention, but it's soulless without the artist to create the film that goes in it. And that was the relationship that he expresses. And I think again of a great Walt Whitman poem, The Learned Astronomer, where the persona of the poem is listening to a great lecture on the galaxy, on the solar system, on the universe, and how it works, and the great mechanisms within the solar system, and the explanations, and then the persona gets up and leaves halfway through the lecture to just go look at the stars. And that's where someone is truly touched. The inexplicable, the mystery needs to remain. And so he likens it to that. There are a couple things where Lindsay really, again, he gets things really wrong. And I agree with the relationship between scientists and artists. Where he gets things really wrong is what he thought the cinema would do for the saloons. Lindsay was a teetotaler, so he was against drinking. And I'd be more than happy to talk more about this over a beer later with any of you. But he did not believe in the saloons. And so to him, the poor, the uneducated, and the vice-ridden are now suddenly crawling out of their shelters and for the first time in history finding a common interest in a tremendous art. And that's where he saw film. And I think that's a great vision because, again, it is accessible to all. However, he thought that theaters become these new social centers, and the saloons would just run out of town. They would be bankrupt. People would just stop with all their vices, stop drinking, because now, as he says, they have fire pouring into their eyes instead of their bellies. Here, the light is as strong to the eye as the whiskey to the throat. So, obviously, didn't work that way. I don't know what he would say now about this new trend toward the brew pub theater, where they have a bar in the lobby, you can get a nice microbrew, you can go watch a movie, drink a beer. I'm sure he's rolling over several times in his grave over that. And to quote him,
Been a marketing move maybe because of prohibition, like saying, this will help prohibition or something.
well, this precedes Prohibition. Again, this is 1915, and so it was just his belief. He was just anti-drinking and anti-vices. And Springfield had its share of saloons and opium dens in downtown, and he didn't live too far from there. So he saw that there was something wrong there, something troubling, and he always wanted everyone to meet his loftiness. And he set this standard so high that, again, I don't want to say, I'll just say it's inachievable. But to him, again, it was possible because, he invested everything into it. So that was one place where he socially got things wrong. That the theater owner would become the new bartender, and then the other is when it comes to music. And again, we're talking about silent film here, so we need to keep in mind the period and the process. One of the problems that he saw here, one is just a logistical problem. How can small local theaters run a film that has national film distribution when you have a problem with accompaniment? And imagine a little theater like in Savoy, right? They get this large film, same film as runs on Broadway, same film that runs on Michigan Avenue, but the local orchestra cannot play the music that comes with it. So now you have this disconnect. And he gives some example of too much improvisation when it comes to this. One, he heard hoochie coochie strains are on the air while heroes are dying. Ragtime being played while a mother prays for her lost son. I mean, can you imagine? Ragtime? He once saw the Battle Hymn of the Republic, in which the song In the Old Shade of the Old Apple Tree was the only song played throughout the whole film, because that's the only song the pianist knew how to play. So again, it's a logistical problem that he sees, but and then there was the phonograph, which he thought just too disembodied. You know, if you're going to have music, it should have the strain of an opera singer. It should have, you know, the blushed face. It should have the veins popping out. It should be as as epic and as big as the art that's put into the film itself. To him, the phonograph was as good in the morning as at noon. It just simply ticks like a clock. It's too much of a machine. And so there's obviously a logistical problem with the music, but to him, again, the theater is, ideal theater is cave-like. You enter into it and you leave different, you leave changed. And so what he wanted was conversation. He did not want a silent movie theater like we tend to want now. You know, we were just talking about this a little bit ago. You know, you're seeing some great new art tonight, and I would not want to wait until after the movie to lean to my neighbor and say, "Did you see that shot?" Because you want to talk about it while it's fresh. And so, you know, something like tonight and this festival is something Lindsay would be extremely proud of, extremely pleased with, because it has that conversation component to it. There's the cave-like theater that he wants. So again, he wants people to talk. And in fact, he wants us to hand out cards when you walk in. And the cards have a set of rules on them, and I'll read them. You are encouraged to discuss the picture with the friend who accompanies you to this place. Conversation, of course, must be sufficiently subdued not to disturb the stranger who did not come with you to the theater. But if you are so disposed, consider your answers to these questions. What play or part of a play given in this theater did you like most today? What is the least? What is the best picture you have ever seen? What pictures seen here this month shall we bring back? So again, he wants us to talk. And really he wants to empower us to all be critics. He would love bloggers now. He would love online reviews. He would love something like Rotten Tomatoes. Because, again, it empowers everyone, the body democratic, the general masses, to be the critics instead of wait for someone else to say what's good and what's not. And you've got to talk during a movie to be able to come up with that. He likens it to baseball, in which each spectator gets to comment as the game goes on, either cheer or boo the umpire's decisions, and so it should be in a movie house. The problem that he runs into here, and it's the general problem with democracy, is that you actually have to listen to everybody. I mean, it's just a fundamental problem with democracy. And when you have the lofty goals that Lindsay has, not everyone's going to meet you there. And so they didn't quite think the way he thought. So the films that would still come around were not quite the films that met his hopes, his standard. I'm not against democracy. I just want everyone to agree with me, right? That's kind of what he wants everyone to see it the way he sees it. Because he's already starting to see the financial orgy, as he calls it, the commercialization. The ones that make the most money, but they're soulless, they're thoughtless, they're artless. So here's where he gets it absolutely right. Again, that democratization of ideas, of knowledge, of information, of art. As he says, let the caveman, the reader of the picture writing, be allowed to ponder over scientific truth. Because now he is the victim of alleged truth. And the cinema was a place where someone could get access to capital T truth. And these are the things that he talks about in the book. He envisions, and this is the prophetic side of things. Film festivals. To him, as we talked, he thought every day should be a film festival. Every movie should be a film festival. You should talk about it. You should enjoy it with each other. You should have a pre-party and a post-party. I mean, it was something it's communal, and that's what he wants. He envisioned film schools before there were any. He envisions film library archives where people can go access films that maybe aren't coming to town again, but are there. They're in a library, so you have full access. He envisioned access to films in public schools. And again, we're talking 1915 here. This sounds old to us, but this is unthought of at the time. And as I talk about some of these other things, think about what our online existence brings us, what the internet has brought us. He wants government documents put in film and just to be run throughout the day. The cinema should always be running because most of these get burned in a furnace, he says, so why not put them in film, put them up, and let people come and see what's happening in their government. He wants scientific museum pamphlets put in film. He wants textbooks put on film. There's no reason why. In fact, the examples he gives are geography, history, zoology, botany, physiology, and all the other sciences. These books should be on film. Because again, those who don't have access to universities should have access to the knowledge. Those who don't have access to, they're unable to read, should be able to access some of the photos, the pictures, access the information. Master's theses, dissertations, these should be all put on film. Because he says, you know, no one, and I quote, no one outside of the university ever hears of it again once you get your degree. But why not put that information out there for everybody? Why can't the mother of three around the corner come and learn something from your dissertation? And again, you put it on film and there it is. But you know, he wants people to come to theaters for this. He had no concept of this happening in the home. And I don't think that he would want it to anyway. I think that's too antisocial for him. I think he would still want these social centers to do this. He wanted to put standard dictionary in film, the encyclopedia. So he wanted to create these archives, which I see as academic internet databases. Same thing. Documentaries, he's talking about documentaries already in 1915, where you could, and I quote, record massive and classical treatises, imperial chronicles, law codes, traditions, religious admonitions, films on safety, films on abstinence, films, he talks about the film Your Girl and Mine, which was produced under the direction of the National Women's Suffrage, religious sermons, film news. So he's talking about all these things again in 1915, beyond just, again, mere entertainment. And I think this is where the prophetic side of things comes. You know, he's talking about an internet way before there is a concept of one. The second book, as I mentioned, largely went unfinished. The Progress and Poetry of Movies, a second book of film criticism, came out in 1922. He, at the time, he's trying to challenge an industry that had grown larger than he had imagined. It became too large of a beast for him to, a powerful industry for him to tame again. Overwhelmed by the task, his disappointment in the audience's lack of prophetic notion. He wanted everyone to have the same prophetic notions he had. There were 14 titles for it. There were pen and ink drawings in all the margins. There's poor writing. There's disjointed thought. Really, it's just a frustrating work, and it's limited as far as how many you can find out there, because it just, again, I read it once, and I felt like that was enough. Whereas the Moving Picture, I've read it a dozen times. I keep going back to it. This just didn't do what he wanted it to do, because again, the industry had taken over. Not the people, and he wanted cinema to be in the hands of the people. So he was extremely frustrated, extremely disappointed in what had happened. if you're ever in Springfield, or if you're interested more in Lindsay, I encourage you to look at the Vachel Lindsay Association. This is the old house. It's right next to the governor's mansion, and that's the association now, where I consider joining. Back when I lived in Springfield, we had begun forming a Vachel Lindsay Film Festival, and then we kind of all disbanded and relocated. But I always thought that would be worthwhile because, and they show films in the home sometimes, and a lot of the films that are mentioned in his book, along with lectures. Jenny Battles used to work there, and she was a great storyteller. In fact, I brought this in. This is an issue of Quiddity in which I interviewed Jenny Battles. It's 6.1, and you can find it online if you Google Quiddity, and you can access a lot of the audio for the program, the audio for the interview, and the interview itself. But she's a great storyteller about Vachel Lindsay, and really, she retired, which is good for her, but unfortunate for us. But you can still access this interview. It's rich with thought about the family and Lindsay himself. He's a delightful man. Again, a little bit foolish, sometimes described as childish, wonderfully hopeful, inspiringly hopeful, and innovative, and someone to look to. I encourage you to pick up this book and read it. It's at times heavy, hyperbolic, as you said, cranky, dated, but there is a lot in there that really makes sense, and it is still applicable today. I do want to leave you with Lindsay's final thoughts for his readers. Talk about hyperbolic. You, there's that second person, you will be the seasoned spirits in the eyes of the wise. The record of your ripeness will be found in your craftsmanship. You will be God's thoroughbreds. It has come then, this new weapon of men, and the face of the whole earth changes. And after centuries, its beginnings will indeed be remembered. It has come, this new weapon of men, and by faith and a study of the signs, we proclaim that it will go on and on in immemorial wonder. What a great final thought on this new art form, cinema. This weapon of men, and it will go on and on in immemorial wonder. I don't know what he would say about our film watching trends today, and that's kind of that's the conversation that I like to leave with. That's the thoughts we walk out with, because again, we're not going to live up to his prophetic vision. I think, as far as what he would say about the current trend toward home entertainment, again, nothing he would ever visualize would have happened like this. The town needs city centers, and the theater is it. So this new cinematic isolationism that we mostly enjoy, home viewing, would, I think, break his heart. And I thought about this last night. What would he think about our new tendency to binge watch? Right? This over-access to films, right? Without time to prepare, read a chapter, go watch it, consume it, and then process it. So now, again, maybe there's too much access, and this binge watching without moderation to him might be as dangerous as the consumption of. It's a new vice. It might be the way he looks at it. I'm going to keep thinking about that, because it's again, every time I read this, I come away with these new thoughts. He would definitely believe in moderation, even in consuming art. Multiplexes goes against this grand cave idea where one enters and it's washed with great light and leaves changed. Drive-ins, I don't know what he would say about drive-ins even. Again, things that he would not have thought about. Green screen technology, when we think about architecture, the architecture he talked about, how it should come forward through the actors just as the actors are in front of it, and what he would say about green screen and new technology, I don't know. Again, these are things I want us to keep thinking about. I wonder what do you think about our current actors, and I try to think of the ones who embody, who have that transfiguration that he seeks. The last time I gave a discussion on this was right before Spielberg's film Lincoln came out. So I was thinking, one, about Lincoln a lot because, again, I'm in Springfield. I'm presenting this at the governor's mansion. I'm thinking of Lindsay and his thoughts on Lincoln, and I'm thinking of Daniel Day-Lewis. And he's one of the actors, handful of actors I can think of who experiences that transfiguration that Lindsay would hope for. He would love Lewis's acting, his method of deep immersion. So again, in my mind, Lindsay's total immersion in everything he did, this inability to separate life from art and art from life, and often this foolish hope and this need for all of us to meet his prophetic hopes and ideas, ultimately led to his frustration, his disappointment, ruined hope. I think that, along with some financial struggles he was having at the end, falling out of favor with the poetry community, some health issues, ultimately led to his very tragic and very horrific taking of his own life. His final words were, "They tried to get me, I got them first." I think Kaufman's right that he is a bit foolish, but I think, again, we need fools like this who take chances and these little gems of brilliance come out. Like who at the time would be thinking about online textbooks? Who at the time, science books and film? But now that's a majority of what we do. And so really, I praise his foolishness. Stanley Kaufman, on a final thought, he concludes the introduction to the 1970 printing with this thought. With all the oddities, the bad guesses, the exaggerations, the prose of judgments, the embarrassing touches of a much lesser Whitman, this book is a considerable marvel. Lindsay had a clear sense that a profound change was taking place, not only in cultural history, but in all human histories, the external and also the most secret. He felt very lucky to be alive at that moment. The poet and evangelist that he was, he saw some fundamental ways to understand and use the change that he had been gifted, and that was film. And so, again, an incredible marvel that what he was able to do. So that's a lot of Lindsay, and Lindsay puts a lot into it. But I appreciate your time and listening, and I hope you pursue a little bit more about Lindsay and this book. And again, thank you for having me at the festival, and I hope you guys enjoy. I'm looking forward to it. And if there are any questions or you want to have a conversation, again, don't tell Lindsay, but we can go have cold beer and talk about more. Thank you.